Hello and welcome to episode 6 of On the Cube Leadership Podcast. I'm Craig O'Sullivan and you're also here with the business pastor, Dr. Rod St. Hill. Dr. Rod, welcome back.
Hey, it's great to be with you again, Craig.
And a good opportunity for us to talk through some events that are happening in pop culture, in politics, in the business world, in ministry, as well as looking at the Bible that we can take metaphors from so that we can learn to be better leaders. And today, we've got a bit of a theme running through today once again. And the theme is success worth it? That's right. Let's obviously we can define success in many different ways, but obviously the worldly success of monetary and materialistic success, is it really worth it? You know, we're going to look at a couple of different examples of things that are happening in the different spheres of the world, and all of them based around people doing certain things to try to achieve success. And, well, they have achieved success. And I suppose what we want to discuss is that success true success as a leader? And are we actually making those mistakes ourselves in a smaller way to be able to highlight it? And what are some better ways forward as far as leaders? And what should success look like? Well, let's get into the first story. Well, if you have been around any bit of social media, you have heard of a gentleman's maybe using the word loosely and being very generous with the word, but a gentleman called Andrew Tate. Now, I've sort of seen this guy. I haven't really followed him, but he's definitely popped up a lot in my consumption. I don't consume much of social media, but I do watch YouTube, a few select YouTube channels. And he seems to be popping up everywhere. And I thought I do have to talk about this guy. I don't want to jump on the bandwagon, but everyone's talking about him. So what can we learn from him as a leader? Well, let me tell you about Andrew Tate. He's a former MMA fighter, and he kind of became semi-famous through that and appeared on Big Brother in UK and was a bit of a controversial figure in there. But in recent times, he's kind of shot to stardom in the last, let's say, 6 to 12 months. And he's became famous because he's really controversial. And I suppose the question I've got to ask you is, does controversy equal success? And should we chase controversy to achieve success? You know, it's a question that I asked Dr. Rod a little while ago when I first saw him. I'm like, he's being very controversial with what he's talking about, with very misogynistic and putting women in their place, and there's a lot of rumors and a lot of videos that are cut up that aren't necessarily truly all about exactly what he's saying, but the baseline of what he's saying is, a woman's place is here, and I'm boss of my woman, pretty much, like very misogynistic. But some of his views are, I would consider, more conservative views around relationships, etc. But he has just presented it in a very controversial way, which has caused him to shoot to stardom and actually caused him to now be banned off pretty much every social media platform. And yet he's still being spoken about everywhere. He operates a quasi-university, he calls it Hustlers University, an online training platform where he teaches people how to be successful males, right? And he's got 127,000 users on there, all paying $50 a month, $50 US a month. And that's roughly about $6.3 million he is making a month. So obviously from his formula, he's found that being really controversial actually causes you to be successful. He actually teaches this in his Hustlers University, that you actually want all of your followers shouldn't all be 100% fans. He says 60%, 70% should be fans, and 30 to 40% should be haters. because it's the fighting, it's the war, it's the people that are challenging each other that are actually going to cause you to go viral. So taking all that into consideration, Dr. Rod, is being controversial worth being successful?
Only if you don't distort the truth. That's what I would say. To be honest, I'd never heard of Andrew Tate until you sent me the topics for this week's conversation. So I don't think he is the most famous man in the world, because if he is, I should know him. But I think it is true that in the Google world, his name has certainly been very, very, very popular. There's no doubt about that. But I think the general principle is, look, being controversial can bring notice to you. There's no doubt about that. But I really don't think you should distort the truth. Ideally, he's speaking mainly to young men, and young men have all kinds of challenges today. It's not a really safe world for young males anymore. They're taught to hate their masculinity, and they really do need some heroes to look up to, who will help them actually become true men in the biblical sense. And I've listened to quite a lot of what he said in preparation for today, and I know his claim that other people have taken very short extracts from his longer form presentations, put them up on their own social media, and have tried to develop their own following based on that. But as I listened to or watched him in his so-called last message, and had a listen to some of the excerpts on social media, I started to think to myself, this guy needs a wisdom coach.
Yes.
He needs a wisdom coach, because look, you should be very, very careful as a public figure not to say things that can easily be taken out of context. So I would say, look, controversy is certainly one tactic, if you like, to develop a following on social media. It's always been a tactic to develop your name or to develop your infamy, perhaps sometimes. But I really do think you've got to be quite careful what you do with the truth. And I think that's particularly important for those of us who claim to be Christians. And he does himself. Says he's a churchgoer, that he gives a lot of money to the church and so on, which is great. But I do think that particularly if you are a significant public figure and you do claim to be a Christian, you do claim to go to church, you've really got to be extra wise in what you say, and be aware that what you say could be used for purposes for which it wasn't originally intended. So I would say that if you're going to use controversy as your springboard to fame, to notoriety, be very, very careful, one, that what you are saying isn't a distortion of truth, and two, just be aware that people can use extracts of what you say, take it totally out of context for their own purposes. So you need controversy with a lot of wisdom.
Yeah, I really like what you're saying about we actually need to be careful not... Now, and this is difficult, but we as leaders need to be very careful that what we say can't be misinterpreted. And that's what you're saying, is like, not just be careful what you're saying, like, speak the truth, but be careful of the interpretation of it as well. And especially nowadays you hear, one of my favorite preachers is Pastor Stephen Furtick. I absolutely love him. Listen to every single one of his sermons I've listened to since he formed Elevation Church, going back probably about 13, 14 years ago, probably now, or even longer than that now. But he quite often says something and then he'll follow it up by going, oh, well, that's going to be cut up and used against me on YouTube. because yes, we need to be very careful of the interpretation of what we do, not just of what we say, not just what we say. I think that's very powerful. How do we how is one, as a very wise man, Dr. Rod, that I would rate you one of the wisest I know, how would you recommend someone be careful that what they say can't be misinterpreted? Because that's not just being careful of what you say. That's now taking it another level of now think of how could this be misinterpreted? How can we do that being such public figures? Obviously you and I, we chat for an hour and a half or plus a week, recorded, post that, like we do other content and everything like that. You preach a sermon every Sunday. I record lots of content for our program and all those sorts of things. Like, how do we be careful of how someone else is going to interpret it?
Well, I think you've got to be very careful to ensure that your brain is connected to your mouth.
I like that. Make sure your brain is connected to your mouth.
and honestly, look, we record sermons at our own church, and we've been putting them up as podcasts for some years now. And I process things as I'm speaking. So first, I am very well prepared. So I very rarely, I think only once in the last 6 years, have I really felt the Lord saying, throw away your notes. I want you to talk about something totally different, which I did. Praise the Lord. I hope I was being obedient to him, and that went well.
Mm-hmm.
But usually I spend quite a lot of time in preparation, often a full day, if not a full day, then at least half a day after having something rattling around in my head, for 4 or 5 days. So there's a process there. And I do have notes. I actually prepare a PowerPoint presentation, which I know is not at all useful in, say, in the context of most social media, but I do that. And that means that I know what I'm going to say before I'm going to say it. But often, at the same time that I'm speaking, I'm thinking. Now,
that's good.
Have I worded this in the best way possible so that it won't be misconstrued? Now, look, it is inevitable that you won't do that perfectly. We're finite human beings. We just can't do it perfectly. And look, if somebody wanted to go through all of my podcasts and put together something which might incriminate me or which might say the opposite to what I intend, I'm sure they could do it if they worked hard enough at it. But I do think I'm careful enough so that nobody would be able to kind of make an industry out of using bits and pieces and perhaps forming a totally different opinion of who I am, or more importantly, what I actually believe in and teach. I think it's an art. It's not something we can necessarily sort out with an algorithm. It's an art. It's an attitude of the heart. And ultimately, I think it becomes a habit as you present.
That's good. First of all, prepare. But the other thing you mentioned there is the habit. I actually want to delve deeper on that, because that was a thought that I had is we almost, okay, so I'm trying to be very careful of how I say this, because this in itself is a bit controversial. People, are like my wife especially, regularly has a go. Maybe she's like, well, you always have to be right or whatever. I'm like, no, I am always right. Now I know that's controversial, and I know that's why I was like, am I actually going to say this? But the reason is because I will never argue something unless I actually know the facts about it. And so there's lots of things that we'll be discussing, but I'll only argue a point if I know it's right. And so while, yes, being prepared is like one thing when you're presenting on social media and everything like that, or something that's recorded, but quite often as leaders, we're just communicating in conversation and we might be being interviewed or something like that. And so I believe that one of the greatest things we can do as leaders is make sure we know what we're talking about. Only talk about things that we know about, because if you don't, you'll be found out. If you don't, you'll, I don't know, beat around the bush or be, or find yourself maybe saying something that sounds right, but it actually isn't. Like a lot of people like misquoting Bible verses and things like that. But I think that yes, be prepared when you present, but also be prepared to know what you know. Like if you stand for something,
Yeah.
like us, I stand for leadership. When I knew that God had called me to become a better leader and to help influence leaders, I went and did masters in leadership because I'm like, I actually want to make sure that I know. I study all the greatest leadership experts. I watch all their stuff. I read all their stuff. I listen to all their stuff, so that when I'm communicating about it, I know about it. We're very big on purpose as well. I could have a conversation with you for days on purpose because I've studied it. I've lived it. I've worked out what I actually think about and what I actually know about it. So I'm going to put you on the spot, Dr. Rod. If we should really know what we know, what would you say are the things that, like, these are the things that I know and that I double down on and that I know is my lane to communicate on?
For me personally,
Yeah.
You did put me on the spot. But I would say that, what God has led me to is definitely a very solid understanding of biblical principles for business.
Yeah.
I've studied it for many, many years now. I've taught it for many, many years. I've had opportunities to see it work, or in some cases not work in practice. I've talked with a lot of people in business. I've observed a lot of people in business. I've become very heavily involved in a couple of global ministries in business. But what I would say, Craig, is I make sure I'm well prepared. I make sure I can explain why it is I've come to a particular piece of knowledge, but I'm also prepared to listen to other people. And every now and then I change my view. There was a famous economist, John Maynard Keynes, who said, after he was criticized because he'd changed his mind on something, he said, well, when the facts change, do you change your mind?
Yeah.
I'm not quoting him word for word there, but that was a sentiment that, well, if you come across new facts, new evidence, new experience that indicates that you need to change your mind, well, change your mind.
Yeah, it's good.
Back down. But I agree with what you're saying, though, in the sense that you need to have the confidence that you know it and you know why you know it. And I think that's where the confidence really comes from.
Yeah.
And yes, have the attitude, I am right, until I see evidence that will cause me to change my mind. And I've done that many, many times. I mean, that's one of the advantages of being on the face of the earth as long as I have. You get experience, you listen to other people, you do lots of reading, you do lots of praying, you hear from the Lord, you get opportunities to put things into practice, and not everything works, and you do change your mind. And in fact, that's what learning is about.
Yep.
If there's no change, there is no learning.
Yeah, it's good. And so to pull this, that was actually a really nice tangent, and thank you for opening up that lane for us, Doctor. I really enjoyed that. But let's step back into is controversy worth the success? Let me share a little bit more about Andrew Tate if you don't know. Well, as I mentioned, he's now been banned off all social media, although he's getting lots of exposure. His Hustlers University has got 170,000 monthly members, which is massive, making 6.5 million. I can't wait till we're at the point where we have more than 127,000 users on our app as well. If you don't know about the app, check out the link below. So, as a shameless plug for our free leadership development program, but he's been banned off social media. He's been raided by the FBI. He's been raided by the police. He's been brought into court for this. He's constantly his name's in question and everything like that. And is that really worth it? Because what I believe and what I hope we get to at the end of today's episode is that we understand that there's always consequences. yes, if we're chasing success, now looking at the figures, it'd be amazing if you made $6.3 million a month. That'd be amazing. But is it worth it that, yes, some of his things have been taken out of context and stuff, but there's some of them that are like, it's a little bit, he might be blurring the line a little bit too much there, or he can't use an excuse that everything's been taken out of context. Because he's very aggressive with the way that he says things, and it does cause a divide. And he admits, he teaches that you need that, 30 to 40% of haters to be able to drive the virality and everything. Like, is it really worth it? Is that what God's called us to? Has God called us to divide? Has God called us to try to make enemies of people? No. He's called us to love each other, like to love each other as neighbors and love each other as ourselves, and to go and make disciples and share and to our neighbors and to all reaches of the earth, not drive a divide so that Jesus becomes more famous for 50% of the world. You don't want something that, because there's lots of people that hate Andrew Tate and would never even take on anything he says. If we were doing something controversial, even in our business world or whatever, or in ministry or whatever, we're Christians and we're representing the King. And so if we do something, and let's be honest, we as Christians and Christian leaders don't have the best reputation. And so is it really worth being controversial and causing some people? The Bible says, don't do anything to cause your brother to stumble. You're doing something to push someone away from Jesus. Dr. Rod, is it worth causing some controversy to try to build our ministry, to try to build our business, to try to build our organization?
My opinion is you shouldn't use it as a strategy or tactic. However, in presenting the truth, presenting what you know, that itself could be controversial. So I don't think you really should use controversy in a sense as a lever.
Yeah.
However, it may come your way depending on what kinds of topics you happen to be tackling. So it might happen, but I think there may be better strategies in the long term in order to build popularity.
Yeah, I like that. It's about the long game, right? It's long-term success is the real success, I believe. Well, let's be honest, the longest goal is the eternal success that we can all achieve, and to be accountable to Jesus. But I really like what you said about sometimes the truth is controversial. Yeah, I'm not saying avoid. I'm not trying to say please everyone, because we can't. We have to stay to the truth.
That's right.
But
Absolutely.
Not use it as a tactic. That's really good. And actually, ironically, a great transition into our next topic about truth. Well, is it worth the opposite of truth to success? Can we lie our way to success? And is it worth it? I don't know if you've seen the news lately. Obviously, we record these things a little bit ahead of time. And so around the time of this recording, the New York Governor General has announced that they are suing the Trumps, Donald Trump and his children, for fraud. $250 million lawsuit for fraud. Because the argument is, not argument, there is kind of facts, and like we always say, when we talk politics, we are not political, but let's see what we can learn from this as leaders. Donald Trump has presented valuations of his properties. This is just a small example of bigger fraud that's happening. I don't know the facts. I'm only seeing what's being presented, but like Mar-a-Lago, which was recently raided by the FBI. Apparently, he valued it at about $750 million to get some cheap loans, and apparently the place is only worth about 75 million. His apartment, apparently he rated it as something like 327 million, and it's only worth about a third of that. And then he said the square footage was like 3 times what it was, or whatever. And there's all these examples of buildings that he's valued at 10 times what it's worth, so that he can get more favorable loans and kind of prove himself to be more successful. I mean, Dr. Rod, my thought, sorry, it's not my thought. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate here for but isn't it the bank's responsibility to make sure that they research what the value of a property is, and he may truly believe in his heart that the place is worth that much, but isn't that just how business is done? Is it okay for us to do these little? I mean, it's not really hurting anyone, is it? Right? It's just him getting a little bit of a cheaper loan and kind of getting a little bit more media of how rich he is. It's okay to do a little white lie to be successful, isn't it?
Well, the problem with little white lies is they eventually become big fat lies.
Yes.
Things get more and more complicated over time, and you tend to have to tell bigger lies to cover up those little white lies from the past. Of course, we don't really know the truth of these allegations, and obviously Donald Trump is a hugely divisive and controversial figure politically, and there can be little doubt that there are plenty of political axes being ground
Yes.
to try to pull him down, and in particular to prevent him from running for the presidency in the elections in 2024. So there's all that in the background, which I think raises a whole range of ethical issues.
Yeah.
But to cut to the chase in terms of how you value your own assets for the purposes of loans, I think, this gets back to the whole thing about honest weights and measures, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The Lord hates dishonest weights and measures. So I think what we need to do, I think, in leaders, if we're in business, is to be honest and then to trust God for the outcome. In response to your issue about, well, the banks should do their homework, they should.
Yeah.
Indeed, they should. And that they should be aware that it's always in the interests of the borrower to paint as favourable picture as they possibly can of their asset position. And, I think painting a favourable picture and telling white lies are different things.
Yeah.
So, painting a favourable picture could be as simple as, looking optimistically towards the future in terms of your projected future earnings and so on. But what do? You make sure you've listed all the assumptions that you're making. So if somebody wants to question those assumptions, they can do that.
Yeah.
In the case of valuation of property, I would always suggest that you use a recent valuation.
Yeah.
If you're a very large organisation, you're going to have to be doing that in any case, generally speaking, to satisfy tax law and so on and so forth. So I think the general principle would be steer clear of lying, even little white lies, because eventually you're going to have to tell a big fat lie to cover up a whole series of little white lies.
Yeah.
And I don't think that the Bible really distinguishes between white lies and big fat lies. They're all lies.
Yes.
And a lying tongue is something which is detestable. So we do need to avoid it. I know we can come under a lot of pressure. We can come under a lot of pressure because we really, really, really need a loan or we need to minimize our tax payment. But look, it just gets back to, I think, be honest and then trust the Lord. And look, even if you do end up in a pretty sticky situation, still trust the Lord.
Yeah,
trust the Lord and rejoice in him
Yep.
always. And look, that is so easy to say. I'm a pastor. I can say that up in front of a congregation every week. But when you actually confront it that's when it becomes really, really difficult. It is the easiest thing in the world to say, be honest and trust in God. And I know I've said this on earlier podcasts, Craig, that it is easy to say. But one of the virtues of saying it often enough is that we will believe it. Yes. And when we find ourselves in a sticky situation, we can actually put it into operation.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. I must admit, I do find myself in that position, trying to, I suppose, force the situation. You know, like kind of. Well, I'll help God out a little bit, I suppose, is the Christian way to say it, but I have learned to not worry about the success. Just focus on, this is my call. This is my purpose. This is what God has called me to. If God has called me to it, now I don't truly believe is like, if it's God's will, it's God's bill. Kind of yes, but there's still consequences to our own decisions and poor decisions and stuff like that. But I have had to, especially in this season of building this app and launching this program and everything like that, it's just been, I mean, I could really force the issue, but I don't want to run ahead of God. And there's been a lot of things, as you know, you've been part of this journey and some of the all of the many challenges we've had in launching this. I've always tried to no, I just got to be patient. I'm not going to rush it. If I rush it, it won't be up to standard. And now that it's launched, there's still a lot of work to do. There's still much more to be done to it, and there's more features going to be added and everything like that. But for now, it's like, you know what? If it had been launched earlier, I wouldn't have been ready for it. So if I had have tried to rush the scenario, but I want to go back to, the lying stuff, because I have a confession. When I was younger and when I was a child, I was a compulsive liar. And I'm trying to think how old I was, but I think I was reasonably young when I had the revelation. And I don't know whether I was around about 10. Maybe I was 12, 13, or maybe I was a little bit younger, but I was compulsive. My parents would be like, "Did you do that?" And I'd be like, "No." And not only would I just say no to avoid getting in trouble, I'd make up a story as well. And like I knew, like I just knew, and then I'd just keep telling another story and another story and another story. Many times I would just find myself so caught up in excessive lies, really bad lies. And I remember this one day, I went to kind of, I suppose, support a lie that I had told, and I couldn't remember what story I had actually told. I'm like, which lie had I actually told? And I realized in that moment, I'm like, you know what? This whole lying thing is so much harder, because I have to keep lying on top and create a new story. And then it takes up so much brain power to try to remember which lie I had told when and which. And I'm like, it's just easier just to say the truth. Even if you get in trouble, it's just easier. And so I learned from a young age that lies just aren't worth it. And yes, you may get immediate success or perceived success out of it. And like you said, who knows what's true out of it? Obviously, Trump has had a lot of controversy around him for many years around the fact that everything is all a facade and everything like that. I mean, not all of it can be a facade. Like there is some wealth there. I mean, he flies a private jet. I don't have one, so he's obviously wealthier than me. He has a couple of buildings. Even if they're not his, he has his name on them. It's better. It's more than what I've got, right? So. Even if this stuff isn't true, the idea of us, because let's bring it back to just us as leaders, it can be very easy for us to overinflate our situation. Number of people at church, like we report on our numbers and we kind of average them out and we round up and maybe we accidentally counted a few people twice and maybe we count all the kids with the adults or what, like, I don't know, like there's, we all know the stories of inflating church numbers and things like that and people always overinflate on social media what their lifestyle is and everything like that. Just be careful as leaders. Be very careful of what lie you're putting out, because as Dr. Rod said, all lies are equal, right? It's not like there's a big lie and a little lie. To Jesus, they're all lies, and Jesus says lies just don't get into heaven. Luckily, we serve under the grace of God and not our own good works. So. Good. That's a good result. But it's very important for us to state the truth everywhere that we go. Going back to the previous thing, like the Dr. always says, it can't be interpreted. Like, you don't want someone to even think or to be able to interpret that you've lied, because if you're building your success in leadership, if you're overinflating your influence, if you're pushing forward your agenda more than it really should be, you're building your success on a foundation of lies. You're building your success on almost like Jesus saying, you're building your success on the sand, right? Rather than on solid rock. And what's the solid rock? Is Jesus, and Jesus is the truth. So is lying worth the success? I would say not, because it eventually comes back to bite you. So, Dr. Rod, final thoughts on lying for success?
Well, I agree with you, Craig. The only thing I would say, just bearing in mind our earlier conversation about controversy and success, there may be some circumstances under which lying is okay. And one such circumstance that comes to mind is Rahab.
Okay.
Rahab, who finds herself in the line of descendancy to Jesus, of course, she lied to protect the spies that Joshua had sent into the city.
Wow.
So there may be some circumstances, but she certainly wasn't using lying for her own personal success. She was doing it for a different reason altogether. So we do need to just make sure that, whatever we do it in line with the Word of God. But absolutely, you're right that in terms of building up our own following, say on social media, or building up our own name, our own brand, then lying is something that should not be in our toolbox.
Yeah. So let's transition into the next topic of obviously lying to cover things up. Because this next story, there was a lot of lies told to be able to cover up some let's say, give someone immunity around some very poor behavior. And I suppose the question I want to pose is, rather than doing something for success, does success allow us immunity? Or should success allow us immunity? Because I know there's plenty of examples that it does, but should it? Should we be immune just because of the success we have or that we create? And the story that I'm going to be talking about is about a gentleman called Roger Ailes, and he was the founder, or was the guy that really founded the Fox News network. And the example of this is actually the mini series that I saw. While in Australia, it's on Stan, but it's called The Loudest Voice, starring Russell Crowe. There's some actually really bad ratings of the series. I actually thought it was a really good series, and a really good series because I actually really like watching things. I really like watching real life stories, or kind of mockumentaries, call them, because obviously it's dramatized for TV. But I really like getting into the workings of things and being able to see why and ask the question why. So the mini series goes on this journey of how Roger Ailes launched, with the support of obviously Murdoch, Rudolph Murdoch? No.
Rupert Murdoch.
Of Rupert Murdoch. I've got a little tongue-tied over that. Let me do that again. Of Rupert Murdoch, obviously he funded it and he owned the Fox network. But Roger Ailes came with the idea and kind of really launched and really grew the Fox News network to be the powerhouse, right wing, the first ever right wing focused news outlet, and was heavily involved in many controversies along the way. But eventually, this series goes through all of these things and all these. It's just how it's kind of highlighting how bad of a human this guy was, right? Now, obviously, it's dramatized. I don't know the real stories and everything like that. But it goes through all these stories of this sexual abuse and the taking advantage of his position of power and influence and him getting involved in rigging elections and all that kind of stuff and sort of controlling the narrative and there's all these controversies that follow him throughout this drama, and it's just crazy how much bad stuff one human can do but get away with it, right? And we watched the whole series through and my wife ended up turning around to me at the end and going, why is it that he was so successful and yet so bad? And I thought it was a really good question, is why do we, and obviously my answer to that was, unfortunately, we in today's society value success so much that we can kind of ignore people's wrongdoings if it's benefiting us. Obviously, the Fox News network was making billions of dollars, and so this guy's making us lots of money so we can turn a blind eye to it. And obviously at the end, Rupert Murdoch couldn't put up with the controversy so much, so he got rid of him, but he kind of got rid of him and protected him on the way out. And so Dr. Rod, should success provide us immunity for being bad humans, to put it blankly?
Look, I'm sure everyone watching will know the answer. It's no. It's no. But I do understand the dynamics, of course, that when we do gain, a lot of public recognition and so on, and we're clearly influential, particularly in a case like the United States, where someone could even influence election outcomes, it's very easy to use that power for the wrong purposes.
Yeah.
And one of the wrong purposes is to satisfy one's own needs ahead of others.
That's good.
And sometimes that will manifest in sexual harassment or sexual abuse of other people, but it can also manifest in many, many other ways, some of which are quite subtle.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things we need to sort out as leaders, basically before we even lead, is that isn't us.
Yeah.
It's not part of our personal culture.
Yeah.
And our organizations should also ensure that they build into the culture of the organization, no, that is not the way we do things around here.
Yeah.
And look, I know that once someone is making a lot of money for us, it's really difficult to do. And look, doing the right thing doesn't always bring rewards. And when I'm teaching ethics at university, I'll say to my students, listen, the reason why you do the right thing is because it is the right thing to do.
Yes.
And look, researchers try to figure out statistically whether doing the right thing ultimately improves the important bottom line. And there are some studies to show that for example, adopting, say, a CSR approach where you take into account people, planet, as well as profit, that can ultimately, in the long run, lead to higher profits. I think at the end of the day, the jury is out. So I don't think we should rely on some kind of causality that runs from personal morality to the corporate good. And we should have those issues sorted out long before we're in a position where we have power.
Yep.
And as far as corporate culture is concerned, it is something which doesn't really, well, it will bubble up from the bottom, but it won't necessarily be the culture you want. The culture has to come from the top. That's one of the most important roles of the senior management staff. And if you're a public company or a large private company with a board, it has to come from the board. So the chair of the board, the CEO, all of the directors, they have to have a personal culture which aligns with the culture that you want in your organization.
Yeah.
But we see this all the time. It happens in the church world, it happens in the business world, it happens in politics. Whenever people develop a position from which they have significant influence or power, and sometimes it comes from the position itself.
Yeah.
That's what we call positional power. But sometimes it's what we call referent power. It's attached to the individual. So we've just got to get these things sorted out long before we're put in a position where there's a challenge. And look, just in the case of sexual impropriety, organizations need to have a policy that essentially says you don't have males and females on their own together in a small space.
Yeah.
So, as a pastor, I will not meet with a woman, say, in my office. That's especially important because ours is a small church, and most of the time there are not other people around. So if I have someone in my office for a meeting, it's very unlikely that there'll be anybody else around. So if I ever meet with a female, it will either be with my wife or it will be, or another female.
Yeah.
Or it will be in an open public space, like an open cafe.
At a cafe, yeah.
I do that, although some people recommend against that as well, because it could set tongues
Looks
wagging.
like you're out dating.
But so use that very judiciously.
Yeah.
But look, and in terms of things like the culture surrounding parties and so on that are organised for work purposes, you've just got to make sure your culture is sorted well before, and that whenever anybody does even step out of line in a small way, someone needs to say, hey, listen, that's just not the way we do things around here. That's not our culture.
Yeah, we spoke I don't know whether it's last week or the week before, we spoke about our values and how important they are. We need you. That's what you're talking about. But on that thing of sexual assault, going back to that's us leaders trying to satisfy ourselves and trying to pursue our own thing. That's not a servant leader. That's not what God's called. That's not what Jesus gave us as an example. Jesus was an example of a servant leader, not taking advantage of people. If you were there genuinely caring for that person, you wouldn't sexually assault them or do anything inappropriate because you actually care about them. And so that's something that it's really important to make that shift is you as a leader, they're not there to serve you. And that's what I suppose could cause a lot of leaders to fall into failure is because they have this, well, you're here to serve my needs. It's actually, no, we're there to serve them and their needs. Also, us as leaders, it's our responsibility to protect them. We have to protect the people we're leading. And we can't be the one that is actually causing the attack. We need to be defending them. We need to be protecting them as leaders.
That's absolutely right. And look, the other thing I would say is that we probably need to change our thinking on leadership. Nearly every definition of leadership is built around the idea of influence.
Yeah.
But I believe leadership goes way beyond that. Yes, it is influence, but it's about empowerment.
Yeah.
Leaders need to be empowering the people around them.
Yeah.
And I think to some extent, we need to get away from the idea of influence. Look, influence is an outcome of good leadership.
Yeah.
But I believe, firstly, a good leader is someone who will appropriately empower those people around them. And I think the word empowerment must be built in to the definition of leadership.
Yeah.
And it's not there. Most of the time, it's not there. If you go to any book on leadership, if you talk to experts on leadership, they will almost always focus on influence.
Yeah.
But I would argue that we need a much, much stronger focus on empowerment. And if, as a leader, my own personal culture is focused on empowerment, there's much less likelihood that I would want to disempower somebody
Yes.
by using them to satisfy my own personal needs.
Yeah, that's good. And empowerment means they're growing. The people around us need to flourish. They need to grow. Because the reason why I emphasize that is I feel like a lot of leaders could use empowerment and like, oh, I'm empowering them to be able to wash the car better. I'm empowering them to, like they may be misinterpreting that empowerment. But what does that empowerment mean? That they're growing. Those people are growing into their purpose, into their calling, into what God has actually called them to, not just empowering them to do your calling as a leader. That's a very good point, Dr. Rod. Also, I kind of want to shift it now to what do we do as leaders if there's someone in our organization that's successful? Should they have immunity, right? And obviously, we know the answer to that is no. I have this conversation with clients all the time, and in recent times, I've actually even had a number of my clients be in a place where I have been telling them for a while that a certain employee is bringing bad culture into their organization. And they're like, oh, but that person performs really well. I couldn't operate my business without that person. And in recent times, they have, for various reasons, those people have vacated their position. And every single time, and not just now, but every single time I've had this conversation with a client, that they're like, but that person's performance. And I'm like, you got to get rid of them because their culture, you don't know how much that's affecting the performance of everything else just because one person performing. I guarantee you, once someone that has a toxic culture is out of your organization, your organization will flourish. And in every single one of the situations, and in recent times, perfect example, my clients come back to me and they say, yep, you're right. They've gone and everything is better in the workplace now. And so we as leaders shouldn't allow one of our team's success to make them immune from their bad behavior as well. What are your thoughts on that, of like being able to manage someone's poor behavior, Dr. Rod, that may be performing?
No, you can't afford to, because their culture will end up supplanting the culture that you really want. And look, it goes back right as far as the whole process of selection of staff.
Yep.
You need to satisfy yourself right at the start that there is an alignment of culture. And look, just as a warning, I've done a lot of job interviews in my time, and listen very carefully for the number of times somebody uses the word I, as opposed to using an expression like the team I led or something like that.
Yeah.
Someone who uses that word I very frequently could well be narcissistic, and they will bring their culture into the organization and they will undermine your culture. So you do need to be very, very careful about that. So you need to listen for cues. that somebody is actually a leader and not or someone who's more a transformational leader perhaps, or a servant leader, because you don't want a narcissistic leader in your organization.
Yeah.
They'll undermine everybody else. And look, I think in the long run, they'll likely do great damage to your organization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. So talking about, moral failings and not putting up with it from leaders transitions us to our next topic, where let's talk about ministry leaders. And once again, it pains my heart. I don't want us to be a podcast that just bags on the church. We love the church. We want to help the church. That's what we're trying to do with all our free leadership resources and trying to support ministry leaders and to help raise up their leaders as well. But we do, if we are to achieve our mission of eradicating poor leadership, we have to highlight examples of poor leadership. And unfortunately, we see far too often moral failings in ministry. And one of those examples is Carl Lentz, obviously former senior pastor of Hillsong, New York. And the reason why we bring it up now is he's kind of popped up in, he did a post in social media just recently of him and his family, and just talking about how, just a brief statement of how tough their year has been and how tough the time has been since him stepping back from having a moral failing, having an affair, and then being exposed and kind of admitting to that, and then going back and working as in his family. But I suppose the question that I want to ask out of this is, okay, we spoke about success giving you immunity. Obviously, he wasn't immune. He stepped down, and the church took the right steps with that. But, and we've spoken about other things with that church recently, but why does it seem that success leads to immorality? Why is it that we see all of these examples of great leaders in the church, out of the church, everywhere, but specifically in the church, these great leaders taking incredible ground for the kingdom, and yet having moral failings? So I suppose the question I want to ask, Dr. Rod, is it possible to have success without having a moral failing?
Oh, yes, I think it is possible to have success, and there are plenty of examples. But we also do know that success can often be one of the factors which seems to be in that mix that explains why somebody has fallen morally. And look, typically it'll be in the sexual area or the financial area. Those are the two most common ones. And look, both areas are very tempting, of course, because we perceive that many of our needs can be satisfied either through sexual relationship or through money. And look, that's part of being a human being. Those impulses are actually meant to be good impulses. If we believe we've been created wholly by God, I mean, WHO, not HOLY, as in the whole person has been created by God. The thing about money, finances, is there's ambition behind that, and ambition is a good thing. Aspiration is a really good thing. And I do believe that one of the characteristics of the Christian faith that separates us from other faith traditions is that we actually honor aspiration. It's okay to aspire to be in a better position tomorrow than you are today.
Yeah.
And I think that goes right across the board in terms of both our walk with the Lord, but also our material well-offness, our social relationships, everything.
Yeah.
And the other thing, of course, is sexual, and God created us as sexual beings for many reasons. Pleasure, yes, but apart from that, for for the bonding of a man with his wife, for the building of family, which is, of course, the basic building block of a whole society. And I think the sexual act also is an affirmation of the covenantal relationship between a husband and wife. So it comes from God, but Satan tries to distort everything.
Yes.
And if we're not careful, we can kind of fall into the trap of allowing, if you like, the carnal. That's the bit of us. It's not really the bit of us, but that the carnality is probably best understood as those moments when we forget that we're living under the wings of the Almighty God, and we step outside and say, well, actually, I am my own God, and that I'm here to satisfy my own needs. And bringing it back down to perhaps a more practical level, as you know, I am Pentecostal. I belong to the largest Pentecostal movement in Australia, and it is affiliated with the largest Pentecostal movement in the world. But one of the things that I worry about a little bit is an implicit model of leadership, which essentially says, I'm the leader and everyone else, you're the followers.
Yep.
And that, I think, can lead to an unhealthy culture where we don't really question the most senior pastor in a church setting, say the senior pastor, or sometimes we call them the lead pastor. But also, I think sometimes they, because of their position, feel that they can't be, as it were, as human as the rest of us.
Yeah.
So they can't admit, for example, that they're getting tired, they're getting stressed, they're getting worried. And, when that happens, and when we don't really seek an appropriate person or group of people to share that with, we may find there is someone on our staff, someone in our congregation who's sympathetic. We have a coffee with them, and one thing leads to another, and you end up in an intimate relationship.
Yeah.
So I do feel that we have to be very, very careful about the mental model that we carry around in terms of what it means to be a leader.
Yeah.
Yes, look, you would expect your leader to be putting a lot of time and effort into hearing from God and obeying God. But I also think there is great danger in the model that says, there's the leader, that it's that one person at the hierarchical head of our church, and everybody else is a follower.
Yeah.
Because that can lead to a culture, intentional or not, where people don't question the leader, nor do they hold the leader accountable. Now, I know that it's the kind of tradition in some denominations that a pastor doesn't go to their own leadership team, but they go up the line, so to speak. That's okay as long as the people up the line have a really good idea of what's going on within that church. And honestly, most of the time they don't. Because if their only conduit, as it were, into that local church is through the senior pastor, then with all the best will in the world, the senior pastor can't give the right picture, because it will always be presented through that pastor's own perceptions. And those perceptions might be quite different to reality. So, look, I humbly submit this to church leaders everywhere. Think really, really carefully about the cultural implications of your leadership model, and ask yourself the questions: are we leaving our senior pastors vulnerable to the possibility of a moral failure, either in the financial or the sexual area? The leaders have to be surrounded by people who love them enough to truly hold them to account. And look, if we're truly submissive to the Lord, surely we're going to be submissive to some method, some system of accountability.
Yeah, we have to be accountable. We have to be accountable, and I think that one thing that I found when I was leading in the church is I found myself in a very lonely place, because my best friend and like the people that I was hanging out with were my leaders from church. And so I had to kind of put on a facade. Not that I was fake, but you kind of have to present, the best version of yourself to them because you're a representative to them. And then I realized that my mentor, the person who I was speaking up, that was upline, I suppose, to me. I'm like, well, I'm constantly trying to impress them because I want them to see the best version of myself. And I kind of found myself in this very lonely place that I'm like, I actually don't have anyone really to talk to. And obviously you became that person for me, Dr. Rod, that you knew the rawness of everything that I was going through. You knew my dark thoughts. You knew my happy thoughts. You knew, the advantage was we were living, I was living under your roof, so you were able to see more of it than even I wanted to share with you anyway, so you got all of me. And I think that served me well over time, is just knowing that there's this group of people, my board, my advisors, my intercessors and pastor and everything like that, that I just share my true thoughts. So my psychologist and things like that. I have people that I'm accountable to. I have those people that I'm accountable to so that they can catch me out early on before I have a moral failing. I can share with you, I'm starting to have these thoughts, and you can see the red flags, and my psychologist can see the red flags, and my intercessors can see the red flags, and they can pray into it. You can give me advice, you can guide me, and I think that it's obviously, be careful of who is it that you're actually, who is mentoring you? And is it someone that you're just trying to impress, or do you actually have a coach, a mentor that you can be honest, you can be real with, and they can be honest and real with you to be able to try to catch you out before you get to that point? I think the other thing that I think also, Dr. Rod, is we just need to be careful of drinking our own Kool-Aid. Right? Like we as leaders can't believe our own hype, so to speak. We can't get caught up in all the praises that everyone gives us, and yes, we need to present this best version of ourselves. We can't believe it. We can't. We have to understand who we are as a person, our humanity, and I suppose that goes back to having mentors, is being able to, like, I share with you, like, my failings and my struggles. And while I don't want us to be negative and only see ourselves as the failures, we actually, Wes Hone used to have this statement, and I absolutely loved it, of how he handles the ups and downs of business. And I suppose we can take this for leadership as well. Is how does he handle the ups and downs of business? Because there's always ups and downs in business. He says, well, I don't get super excited with the ups, and I don't get super depressed with the downs. So we shouldn't get overly excited with our success, but also don't be affected by our failures as well. Like don't wallow in mistakes, I suppose. What's your thoughts on keeping that level head and not drinking our own Kool-Aid, so to speak?
Oh yes, I think we do have to be fairly careful of that. I mean, it's lovely when people congratulate you. I think it's great, and it's good to receive positive feedback. And in fact, when people give me positive feedback, I do thank them for their encouragement because I need it. Look, I'm very, very blessed because I have a wife, 2 adult married daughters, and they are really, really good at keeping reality before me. I'm really, really grateful for that.
Yep.
And I remember once, this is just a tiny incident. We're at a restaurant And the waitress she put some food before me, and I said, "Thank you, darling." And one of my daughters, she looked at me and she said, "Don't do that, Dad."
Yep.
And she probably won't even remember that. But I thought, guess what? This is my family saying terms of endearment like that are for family.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
And I've never, ever said that to someone who wasn't family since that time.
That's really good.
And I really love my family for that. And often jokingly tell people, look, my family will tell me when it's time to stop preaching.
Yeah.
And honestly, I trust their judgment because, see, I know how much they love me.
Mm.
My wife, my daughters, my sons-in-law, they love me. And they love me enough to be that honest with me.
Yeah, that's good.
And I just hope all of us have family like that. Perhaps we don't. But the other thing is the people in our accountability group, they need to be like that.
Yeah.
They need to love us enough to be 100% truthful with us. And we have to trust them so much that we can tell them our innermost fears and thoughts.
Yeah.
And that is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
I have some friends like that, and I consider myself very, very blessed.
Yeah. That's good.
Am I always totally honest and open with them? Like, I would have to say I failed at times in that area. But I believe in accountability. I think it's really, really important. I think if you look at the early church, there were mechanisms in existence. The church wasn't organized in the way that it is today, but there was a basic organization of the church of the city. And I think there were some principles in there which are really important for us today.
Yeah.
Maybe we could summarize it by saying, don't ever be a lone leader. Don't be a lone ranger.
Yeah, it's good.
Have people around you. And if you don't have a family like mine, and you've got to be pretty tough to survive a family like mine, let me tell you. But if you don't have a family like mine, just pray that God will bring into your sphere. You just need 3 or 4. You don't need a lot of them. You just need 3 or 4. And go to them for counsel.
Yeah.
Go to them when times get tough. And don't forget to be honest with God.
Yeah.
Tell him.
Yeah.
Tell him what you're thinking. Tell him what you're feeling. If you do feel attracted to one of your staff, tell him.
Yeah.
And give him permission to work on this area of your life. Give him permission. I do that. There are issues right now. I hope my wife and family don't see this. Not serious. It's not serious. But there are issues I'm taking to God.
Well, you're addressing it before it's an issue. That before it's serious. That's what you're saying.
You know, I can't do this. I need you to help me in this situation. So do that. Yeah. We're not meant to be self-sufficient.
Yeah.
God never created us to be lone leaders. He didn't create us to be lonely leaders either, but he didn't create us to be lone leaders.
So I like what he said, like don't be a lone leader, but I actually kind of want to play on that wording a little bit, is like don't be alone as in don't be alone without mentors and advisors and some people you can be honest with, but don't be alone with the opposite sex, like you were saying earlier. And understand, like you're saying, don't be alone without God. Like, don't do this without God. Remember, I think that kind of to wrap up this part is, I feel like just reminding people is we're not here to serve our vision. It's not us about becoming us successful. It's, actually a prayer that we prayed at the start of this is the prayer that Jesus prayed, is like, glorify me so that the Father in heaven will be glorified. That we need it. I think when we remember that we are just here serving the mission, the purpose that God has for us, that He's the one that provides our success for us. Yes, we have to work for it. Yes, we have to do our part, but God is the one that provides the success. I think it makes it much easier for us to stay humble, right? It makes it easier for us not to drink our own Kool-Aid. And when we realize that it's God that's doing all this in partnership with us, that it's God's path that we're following, that God's called us to serve these people that He's entrusted us to lead, and it just makes it so much easier to kind of not get wrapped up and believe that we are the successful or powerful, kind of satisfying our own needs, but also that we're infallible, right? And so my encouragement to you as a leader, whether you're in ministry or in the marketplace or in politics or wherever you are, just believe you're there serving the purpose that God has called you to. You're not there for your success. You're there to be successful so that God can be glorified through your success. And I hope that kind of helps shift your focus a little bit. But let's transition into our last segment about chasing success for ourselves or for the glory of God. And I actually want to take us to another leadership lesson from Luke and actually go to Luke 22, verse 1 to 6. Now the feast of the unleavened bread called the Passover was approaching, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some way to get rid of Jesus, for they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered Judas, called Iscariot, one of the 12. And Judas went to the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard and discussed with them how he might betray Jesus. They were delighted and agreed to give him money. He consented and watched for an opportunity to hand Jesus over to them when no crowd was present. And I suppose I want to end on, we're talking about all these negative parts of success, and I kind of want to finish on this. The leadership lesson that I learned from this is, are we betraying anyone to further our career? Are we like Judas? He betrayed Jesus, his leader, so that he could further his career. He could get in and get some money, but also, appear famous and everything like that. Are we betraying? Are we gossiping? Are we saying bad things behind someone's back? Are we, that's what really actually jumped out at me is, I'm guilty of this. I've kind of talked badly about someone to make me look like I was in a better position than them or whatever. But we all know how that story ended. He ended up hanging from a tree, right? And betrayal always catches up with us. And so, Dr. Rod, how do we avoid getting caught up in betraying someone to try to force our own agenda?
I've given this one some thought. Look, I don't pretend to have the answer, but I think we have to settle in our own minds first. So firstly, we have to be agreed within ourselves that we are going to think well of people and also of the organization we work for. If we're employed by a board as, say, the CEO of a company, we're going to speak well and we're going to do well.
That's good. Think well, speak well, do well.
Think well, speak well, and do well.
I like it.
And look, I've used this idea usually when I'm teaching in the area of generosity. We often measure generosity, for example, by how much money we give to a cause, for example. But you're not expressing generosity unless you're thinking generosity,
Yeah.
nor are you going to express generosity if you don't speak generosity.
Mm.
And I think this can apply to the context of organizations. We need to think generously about those around us.
Yeah.
We need to speak generously. In other words, if you can't find something good to say about someone, just don't say it.
Yes.
If it's negative, then find a way of broaching the subject with the person involved. And in the organizational context, do generously. So be generous with your time, your energy. In other words, be a fully engaged employee or
Yep.
colleague. I think that's probably the best way to guard yourself against becoming, as they say, a Judas.
Yes.
The term, of course, has entered the lexicon. You know, we hear people say, "Well, there's a Judas in the camp." Sometimes people who are insecure say that kind of thing. But you know, we need also to understand, I think, or at least maybe speculate about what caused Judas to be open to the influence of Satan. The
Yes.
Bible says here, of course, in verse 3, then Satan entered Judas. Now, I don't know whether that happened literally or whether that's more like a turn of phrase to
Yes.
essentially say he was influenced by bad stuff rather than good stuff. But it appears as if he was very disappointed that Jesus didn't turn out to be who he thought Jesus was supposed to be.
Because he was
And
there for because he thought if he was part of that group, Jesus was the one that was going to become king and everything like that. And
That's
so
right.
he was there for
Jesus
influence.
was going to upend
Yeah.
the order of the day.
Yeah.
Even though Jesus did teach that his kingdom was not of this world. And there were others too who I think had a similar expectation. So it may be, I don't think the Bible is all that clear on this, but it may be that what ultimately drove Judas to betrayal was disappointment in Jesus. He didn't turn out to be the leader he thought Jesus was going to be. And I've been party to, and actually I'm ashamed to say I've occasionally engaged in that kind of undermining of a leader where we say, well, the leader didn't turn out to be the person we thought they were going to be, this, that, and the other thing. But it really is debilitating.
Yeah.
It's debilitating to you personally. It's obviously debilitating to the leader, and it's debilitating to the organization. Honestly, if there are issues with the leader, you need to have them sorted out. One good trend in the whole sort of human resources management area these days is what they call 360-degree reviews, where you get an opportunity to review the senior management team, the senior leaders in your organization. Use that wisely. And if the board, for example, are wise, they'll take that into account when they're doing their own annual or semi-annual review of their CEO. The other thing which has been around for a while now is what they call organization climate surveys, where you're not necessarily looking at individuals, but you're having a look at you're really looking at what's going on with the culture of the organization. So you can manage it sometimes through those ways. But I think at the end of the day, what drives us to gossip, other than pure envy, I think it is this mismatch between our expectations of the person whom we're undermining. The mismatch between our expectations and what they were actually able to deliver.
Yeah, it's quite powerful when we can. It goes back to that. What I was talking about is like trying to force the hand, right? Trying to kind of run ahead of God. That we need to leave God to kind of do his part, but we need to know what our lane is and what our purpose is and what our calling is, and understand that someone else may have a different calling. And if they're not following it properly, if we're in a certain position to address that, then we need to address that appropriately. But if not, we need to stick in our lane and just leave God to be able to deal with those. I mean, I've been in situations where I've, left poor leadership and tried to do my best not to talk poorly about those people, because that's God's domain. It's between, as David said to Saul, it's for God to judge between us who's right and who's wrong. And so I think that when you're very, very correct there, is the betrayal is a result. The betrayal isn't the cause, it's a symptom. The cause is the fact that there's something wrong there, and we feel like that's the only way that we can kind of get our justice or get our position. Because I know not every one of you out there are wanting to betray someone so that you can take over their position intentionally. It may just be that you're hurt by them. It may be that something that they're doing might actually be affecting you, and you don't believe that they're doing the right thing. Well, stick in your lane, report it to the right people that need to be reported to. Don't gossip, don't make things up. Maybe address it directly with the person to see if they can do better, because you don't want to be known as the person that betrays someone. Because we've mentioned this before about, the way someone leaves, the way someone enters somewhere is the way that they leave. And if someone enters in betrayal, then they're going to be exited by betrayal as well. But you don't want that label on you that that's someone that you can't trust. Because whether we're leading or being led, or in a subservient position, and if we have actually betrayed someone, it's very difficult to be able to get people's trust back. And so I think that as leaders, we need to make sure that we can build trust with the people below us and the people above us, so that we can be in good standing and have, about to say that word that Dr. Rod earlier said don't say, but influence. We can't influence someone if they don't trust us. And we influence not to be able to manipulate or influence them, but as Dr. Rod said, so that they can grow, to empower them, whether they're up the ladder run or down the ladder run. If people don't trust us, we have no influence. And if we as Christians want to be able to influence people for the kingdom, if people don't trust us, like most people have a distrust for Christians as a general, then how are we meant to witness for the King? How are we meant to introduce people to the love of Christ if they don't trust us? If we're just known as that deceitful snake that betrays people, and you don't want that person on your team, or you don't want that person leading you because they're just going to betray you to take all the glory for themselves or whatever, So, Dr. Rod, I really, really like those three statements. Think well, speak well, do well, and from that, the right culture should flow. Before we end, Dr. Rod, what last statements do you have around betrayal?
Well, in the end, it didn't work, did it?
No.
In the end, it didn't work because Jesus still fulfilled his purpose. And I think, for those of us who have been betrayed ourselves in the past, and I know many will in the corporate world and sometimes in personal life, just know this is not the end of the story.
That's good.
As indeed it was the case with Jesus. It wasn't the end of the story. It didn't mean he was thwarted in fulfilling his own purpose for coming to this earth. So if you're on purpose yourself, betrayal won't necessarily mean it's the end of the line for you. So, continue to focus on your purpose, the purpose that God has given you. Continue to trust in him. Trust that he gave you that purpose, and trust that he will open doors for you. He will see to it that you will fulfill your purpose. And you know what? If the going gets tough, and if you get cranky with God, or you get disappointed with God, then feel free to tell him, because I can guarantee it won't topple him off the throne, and he's heard it all before. Because if he hasn't heard it from you, he's probably heard it from me.
We're just banding together. That's really good. So I suppose, to wrap up today's theme, is success worth it? Is the wrong things, doing the wrong things, worth doing to pursue success? And is success worth it, considering it leads to moral failings? Well, I hope that our conversation today has empowered you to be able to know that success in and of itself is not a bad thing, but we need to pursue success in the right way, with truth, with an honest, humble servant heart, to be able to pursue that success, not for our glory, but so that God will be glorified through our success. So thank you very much, Dr. Rod, for sharing your wisdom yet again.
You're very welcome, Craig. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Awesome. Hey guys, so that's the end of our episode. If you liked any of the topics and have any ideas that you want to add, put a comment below. We'd love to be able to read your comments. Give the video a like if you appreciated this, and consider subscribing to the channel for more faith-based leadership development content. See you in the next episode.